Mealworm Inquiry Project by Adelise Barossa, which is me. What is a mealworm? Mealworms are the larval form of the mealworm beetle. Scientific name, I am about to butcher some names, so my apologies in advance. Tenebrio molitor. Higher classification, mealworm beetles, family Tenebrinidae. Order beetles, class Insecta, and life cycle is between 4 months to a year. Mine, of course, did not last that long. So this is a mealworm anatomy. This is the head, the thorax, which has 3 parts, and the abdomen and the spine. Here we can see the eyes, the antennas, which later on grow when they turn into beetles, which you will see they get pretty big. And then you see the legs and claws, which they use to climb and eat their food, and of course the mouth. Life cycle, so they have 4 stages in their life cycle. They have the egg, larva, pupa, and adult. And on the left side, we see a more detailed version. Of course, it's still the larva, the pupa, and the adult, but there's kind of just cut up into different parts. So they start off very tiny, and then they grow kind of big. They kind of, not too big, but they get kind of thick once they're ready to start turning into a pupa. So then there's this shedding stage, then they turn really white, then they kind of start turning brownish, but not too brown, and then that's when they turn into the white beetle, which I managed to get a picture of that. I thought that was kind of nice. And then they turn into a brown beetle, which is just saying, like you just changed. And then there's the full adult, which is the black beetle. Oh, and of course, there's the antennas that I was talking about earlier. So what are mealworms typically used for? They're used for pet food, to feed animals like reptiles, fish, and birds. And they mostly are used for pet food because they have high protein. What do mealworms eat? They eat grains, fruits, vegetables, and organic material. Which my experiments are basically based on this. I found this information on Google, but I did want to prove that they in fact did eat grains, fruits, and vegetables, and I also wanted to know if they have a preference. So that's what my experiments were about. Mealworm storage. It is recommended that they're stored in a large container and in a clear container. So it's best if you store them in a plastic or a glass container because you want to be able to see their waste and how much food they've ate, or if their food has gone bad. You can also see if you have a lot of dead mealworms, and if you have a plastic container or a glass container, so you can easily just take them out. Wood and cardboard is not recommended because they can climb up the cardboard or they can shoot through them. It's also recommended for you to have about 2 to 3 inches of oatmeal, cornmeal, or bran meal in their container for bedding. And it's also recommended for you to grind up their oatmeal or cornmeal just so that it's easier for them to move. I did not do that because I found that information later on in my experiments and project, and I figured that they worked fine the way they were, so I never ended up changing it, and I just left it how it was. Mealworm investigation. My mealworm investigation was regarding the food that mealworms do like and prefer. So here I put inquiry and hypothesis questions for my experiment. So this is basically my questions. Do mealworms like fruits? Do mealworms like vegetables? Do mealworms like grains? If they do like fruit, do they prefer oranges or apples? If they do like vegetables, do they prefer celery or carrots? And if they do like grains, do they prefer crackers or bread? My hypothesis for each one was, if they do eat both apple and oranges, then obviously they like fruits. If they do eat celery and carrots, then obviously they like vegetables. And if they do eat both crackers or bread, they do eat grains, or they do like grains. Trial and error. So I bought my worms on February 20th, 2021. I bought 100 tiny worms, which you can see they're pretty tiny. I was still pretty grossed out by them though. I was freaking out. My anxiety was through the roof. I was confused on how to do the experiment, so I only put celery, which I then realized that the experiment was not testable and that I would need to include another type of food so that I can determine what the mealworms preferred. I go more into detail in this in my journal entries. Trial and error again. About a week later, I had changed the bedding, took out the celery, and decided to add oranges and lettuce to try my new experiment. These pictures were taken on March 4th, 2021. In the bottom image, there is a pupa. In the top image, there is a beetle that had just recently changed, which is why the color is not black. So kind of like how we saw in the life cycle, we know that the black beetles is the beetle that has been a beetle for a little while. After I took these images, I realized that the experiments were not measurable because I was using foods in different food groups. So then I tried again. Finally, did an actual experiment, which was oranges or apples. My inquiry question was, do mealworms like fruit? Hypothesis was that if mealworms like fruit, then they will like all fruit. So basically, like if they eat both of the fruits, they will like all fruits. Results was that mealworms indeed like fruit and they prefer apples. At first, I could not tell what the worms preferred. Every time I would look over at them, there would be an equal number of mealworms on both fruits. Eventually, I walked in one day and saw that most of the mealworms were on the apple, which is why I concluded that they preferred apples. In the first image, there's 2 worms on an apple and 2 worms on an orange. So the reason why you can't see it's kind of the angle, and if I would try to get at the other angle, then you would not be able to see the worms on the apples. But here you can see that I have an arrow pointing to, like, let me see if I can write on this. So here is a worm on an apple, and then here's a worm on another apple, and then here's a worm on an orange, and there is another orange kind of like here in the back, and there is a worm on that orange. The orange had just sunk, I'm assuming with the movement that from the worms. So in the second image, there are multiple worms on multiple apples, which we can see that they're here and kind of just throughout the side. Experiment 2, it's carrots or celery. Do mealworms like vegetables? If mealworm eat both vegetables, then they will like the vegetables. Like my answer would be yes. Results, mealworm like vegetables, they prefer celery. This experiment was a bit difficult. It lasted longer than the first because even though the mealworms liked the vegetables, so even though they ate both the celery and the carrots, they weren't really like on top of fruit as much as, on top of the vegetables the way they were with the fruits. So I think that had to do with the fact that the fruit has more water retention, whereas the vegetables don't have as much water retention. Eventually, I noticed that the mealworms were on the celeries more than the carrots. So then that's how I decided that they like the celery more than the carrots. And it probably has to do with the fact that I believe celery has more water retention than carrots. Experiment 3, bread or crackers. I think this is the experiment that just kind of killed a lot of them, simply because grains are dry food. So they didn't really have any type of water. So like towards the end, there was like barely any worms, but I don't know if maybe it also had to do with the fact that a lot of them were turning into into pupas. So here you can see, you know, we got 2. We got a few more right here. I think this is 1 right here. So there's a lot. There was like a lot turning into pupas. There's 1 right here. There were a lot of beetles by this point. My inquiry question was, do mealworms like grain? Hypothesis, if the mealworms eat both, then they like grains. Results, mealworms like grain, they prefer bread. So I know my hypothesis was that if they eat both, they like grain. I never caught a worm on top of a cracker at all. But even though I didn't catch one on top of the cracker, I didn't say that they did not like grain, because either way, they still ate bread. So I do think that they like grain. I just think it would depend on the type of grain. I think maybe they probably like grains that are more similar to bread. So because I did see worms on breads, I concluded that they prefer grains. These are images of beetles. Here's an adult beetle, like one that has been a beetle for a minute. As we can see, it is hiding because mealworms prefer dark environments. And here we have a lot of pupas here. I just realized this image had that. And here we have a beetle that hadn't just recently turned, but it's still kind of pretty new to the beetle world. So this is my uh-oh moment, because a lot of my worms were dying. I put few mealworms, but I think it was a lot of worms. I think once I got to the second experiment, a lot of my worms died. And I just think it had to do with the fact that they didn't really have as much water, kind of like when I did the fruits, you know, they definitely did have water, because the fruits do have a lot of water. Whereas with the vegetables, you know, there was celery, but that's still not a lot. And then when it got to the grain, it was just done for, because that's a dry type of food. My reflection is based on this experiment. I think that mealworms overall prefer fruits because they can also get water from the fruits. I was also really grossed out by the worms, and at the end I was still grossed out, but I do think that it was a pretty interesting assignment. And this is my resources where I got information regarding the mealworms, and that is the end. Thank you for watching.